I'd like to transition into that now. And quite a number of questions have come up during the workshop over the past 2 days, as well as questions have come up even as a result of the comments each of our panelists have made here this afternoon. So while I may direct questions to an individual panelist, I invite other panelists who want to comment to do so as well. Just ask for people to be as responsive as they can and as succinct as they can, just so we can see how many questions we can get addressed that have come in. Let's have some fun. Dr. Bernard, I'll address this first question to you, if that's okay. NIH and FDA have had policies in place for quite a while to assure appropriate inclusion of various populations in clinical research. Just wondering sort of why any new policy that's put forward, such as the NIH inclusion across the lifespan policy, why do we think it will be any more effective than those in the past, perhaps? And what are the options available to NIH, to FDA? Dr. Abernathy would like to have some comments, I suspect. But what are the options available to enforce policies for inclusion?
So thank you for the question. And I think that the new inclusion across the lifespan policy is an opportunity that really hasn't previously existed. Yes, there was a policy on inclusion of children, but there was not one that mandated inclusion of older adults. And as I was able to show you from our phase 3 clinical trials, oftentimes the ages of individuals included in clinical trials was lower than you would have expected. So it's a new policy from that perspective. And there are other tools that have been provided through the 21st Century Cures Act, particularly the requirement that all clinical studies that are reported to ct.gov have a final report within a year of completing the study. So it will be possible to see within clinicaltrials.gov whether there's been adequate inclusion. So there's kind of the peer pressure you might have there, and then the real pressure that can be brought to bear by agencies such as NIH and FDA. Certainly we at NIH anticipate looking very carefully at how well this new policy has done in skewing the populations to be more appropriate for the disease entities and conditions that are being studied. It will take us another 4 or 5 years because, again, it only went into effect in January of 2019. But among those things, they are levers that will help us to get in the right direction.
And I think, as I reflect on part of the question, which was, why do we think adding more policies will make any difference? Why do we think talking more? I go back to one of the things I feel is really important, which is actually to demonstrate what it looks like for these policies to be in action. And I think that demonstration is important on multiple sides. So it's important for clinical trialists to see what does it look like when we widen the eligibility criteria to enroll people of many different ages and also potentially with many different comorbidities. It is important for life sciences companies to see that the FDA is comfortable with that. It's important for statistical reviewers to see what happens as we think about now needing to plan the statistical analysis plan or also conduct the analyses downstream. And so all of those pieces of seeing what it looks like will help to improve comfort. And it'll also tell us where we need to fix things. One of the things that we're learning right now on all the COVID-19 real-world data work is that there's a lot to be learned just by doing it and then adjusting along the way.
I wonder if I might just comment there, and I actually have a question for Dr. Bernard. If I'm, my general comment is that the NIH, through its grant mechanisms, does have a lot of control if the policies are enforced, because if you don't get your next grant because of what you did in the last one, you're likely to try to fix it ahead of time. FDA has a bit of a different situation because it's dealing with a global industry, and the risk of being out of sync with other countries is significant. But my question, Dr. Bernard, is about the NIH. I mean, my view of the slide you showed is that NIH has achieved equanimity with the population in terms of proportion of African Americans and proportion of women now in clinical trials. The Hispanic population looked a little bit low for the U.S. population, but are there specific plans to require that people enroll proportional representation of, let's say, over 65, or how is it actually going to be? How is the policy going to be implemented? And am I correct in what I said about success with African American and female enrollment?
So the data that I showed you in terms of demographics was for only the aging category. So it shows enrollment of women, men, race, ethnicity. We have about 300 other categories in RCDC, and I quite honestly did not look at the aggregate. I just pulled that out since we're talking about older adults here. In terms of having specific predicted percentages of various groups in studies, the NIH position is that the distribution of subjects in a study should be in keeping with the scientific question that's being asked. So if you're asking a question about Alzheimer's disease, for instance, we would absolutely expect that that distribution is going to be skewed towards much older individuals because that's where the disease is manifest. Whereas if you're asking a question, for instance, about pneumonia, what we found when we were doing that trans-NH portfolio analysis is that it had a bimodal distribution because apparently there's a lot of pneumonia in infants and neonates that is important. So it really depends on the questions being asked. And that depends upon the peer review panel to look at things carefully and be thoughtful in their feedback. And I must give the peer review panel's credit that I've seen in summary statements since January 2019. There have been several cases where there's a criticism, why is there an upper age limit? Why is there even a lower age limit when you're targeting older adults? So it needs to be scientifically justified. And then the implementation of that at the NIH level is up to the institutes and centers to appropriately monitor what's going on. We at the National Institute on Aging, with our significant growth in budget, for which we are very grateful to the American people, taxpayers, and Congress. James Raff, we had a $3.5 billion budget as opposed to 3.1 when that last budget was done. We've seen quite a growth, and we recognize that we need to have more systems in place to be able to monitor and track, and we're in the process of doing that so we can be on top of whether the studies that we're supporting are meeting their goals in a timely fashion.
Thank you, Dr. Bernard. This is great. And thank you, Dr. Keller, for the question. I like the more freewheeling conversation. If I could, I'll direct the next question to Dr. Abernethy. And I wanted to pick up on comments earlier that were made around, for example, the work that FDA is doing to be very proactive in responding to the challenges around conducting clinical trials in the era of COVID-19 and providing guidance, on clinical trials. Of course, the ongoing development of telehealth very rapidly in the past 5 months or so. And I just wonder, Dr. Abernethy, could you share if any particular thoughts you have about any of the learnings that have happened that may translate into permanent change in terms of how some of the clinical trials are done? I think there seems to be considerable interest from participants in this workshop in whether or not some of these learnings could be made more permanent.
So first of all, we have a true commitment to learning from COVID-19 and really truly understanding what should be potentially put in place for the future. And I think that the changes that have been made for clinical trials within the context of COVID-19 fall into 3 different categories. There were those aspects as it related to the conduct of clinical trials and tools and solutions that we had already been signaling and advocating for through guidances in the past. So for example, remote monitoring has already been highlighted in prior guidances. And really COVID-19 and telehealth has advanced that as almost a necessity because so many people could not go for their required visits. There are those that are aspects related to the public health emergency where emergency guidances, for example, have put us in the situation of needing or allowing certain capabilities specific to the public health emergency. So, for example, the availability of an investigational product at a physician near you rather than going to the specific location of the original clinical trial. And those allowances will be in the context of COVID-19, the public health emergency, and then will be removed, but we have the opportunity to learn from them going forward. And then there's the third category, which is the conduct of clinical trials right now. What does it signal might also be valuable and needed in the future, such as better biomarkers, et cetera. And I think what you're gonna see from COVID-19 is that all three of those will come together. The amplification of what we've already been signaling, such as remote visits, learning from those things we've liberalized right now, and learning what else needs to be added or could be added for the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very helpful. Dr. Califf, I'd like to address the next question to you, and it sort of picks up on something that you made in some of your observations here kicking off the panel. Earlier in the workshop, we were reminded of the pediatric exclusivity provision that Congress put in place, I think in 1997, providing that 6 months market exclusivity to manufacturers who conduct studies in children. And I'm wondering from your perspective, again, all panelists may have something they want to share on this, but is a similar model feasible to incentivize drug studies among the older adult population? I'm particularly interested because of the emerging research from the field of geroscience that suggests that drug interventions to slow the onset of multiple chronic diseases of aging may be viable. It seems the question's down to whether or not there are adequate incentives, carrots, I think was mentioned, for the clinical trial work to be done. So Dr. Califf, do you have any particular perspective on that?
Just a couple of points. As an academician, I had a chance to participate with our group at Duke in doing the assessment of the value of that pediatric exclusivity provision. And as you know, it's been a little bit controversial because some see it as a giveaway to pharma for things it should be doing anyway. But there's no question that it drove a huge change in the inclusion of children in studies. And we could, on the negative side, the big push by pharma was for drugs that weren't targeted for children but had a high sales value, where 6 months made an enormous difference. So getting the balance right on these incentives is absolutely critical. The second point I'd make is that, if we give a break to everybody, and Dr. Abernathy sort of addressed this, I'd be really interested in our current thinking about it. Pretty soon you end up with the situation, if everybody has a break, then what is the normal? And I think this is an issue that the National Academy Drug Forum is going to grapple with a bit, because I don't think there's any doubt that in addition to the pediatric exclusivity, the orphan disease program and the accelerated approvals, there are 4 ways of doing it now, largely related to cancer drugs. Those things have worked. But part of the result may be that there's a negative incentive to tackle the common chronic diseases that cause 80% of death and disability in our country. So I don't think anyone in their right mind would argue to go back on the progress that's been made in rare disease and cancer. On the other hand, we have to do something to incentivize being able to tackle these big issues. So I actually think there's not a clear answer, but I believe we had better directly address it, because the direction we're on right now is not the right one.
Thank you, Dr. Califf. Would either other panelists want to comment on that?
I'll comment there, and also I think it aligns with one of the questions that's in the Q&A what Rob's just saying, and also sort of this critical point of, if we think about some of the carrots and sticks that exist, for example, in orphan drugs, how do we think about that for medical problems that impact a large number of patients and in large scenarios. And my question, and this is one of the points, Rob, that may really need to be tackled head on right now, is that as we move towards what may actually start to look like smaller and smaller indications, because you take the scenario of the older person with sarcopenia, with heart disease, and what we understand about this drug in that compilation, starting to get to smaller and smaller indications, do we end up in a space that actually everything starts to look like rare diseases because the way we've defined indications gets smaller? And so, as we start to overlay the practical realities of personalized medicine with the incentives that, for example, go along with orphan drug exclusivity, like how might that story play out? And I don't really know what this will ultimately look like, but I do think that as we think about the complexities of the older individual that we were talking about before, the practical realities of better understanding biology, biologic plausibility, and better targeting of drugs, which is what we're hoping in really strong drug development, right? And then the potential capabilities that are enabling through, for example, policies like orphan drugs. It's interesting to see where that potentially goes. And I think we need to think about it now.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce incentives work in this industry. And, the two big things, as best I can tell, that affect what drugs are developed are where's the science? And there, the big incentive is how the NIH is funded. I would argue the war on cancer, it took a while, but it really worked. And the genetics program at NIH has had a huge impact on rare diseases, now we know. And so what's the equivalent of that? And then for the most part, if you look at the industry where I've been involved in venture capital now through my work at Google, a net present value calculation is pretty easy to do. And if you're going to get paid more money on the back end and you can do smaller trials with help of the FDA that's mandated on the front end, that's where the industry is going to go. So I think we all know the theory. We need to reduce it to practice now because, and I would argue particularly for the United States, because we are now in last place in health outcomes for among financially high-income countries. And the COVID crisis has actually made it worse. We're looking substantially worse than other countries in that also. So when the dust settles, we got some work to do in this country to do the old things well, but also develop the new things that might work.
Thank you, Dr. Califf. I wonder if I could pose this question to all three panelists, whoever wants to jump on it. It came up earlier in the workshop around, while we're focusing on underrepresentation of older adults in clinical trials, the issue of the underrepresentation of diverse populations in clinical trials also was noted. And given the recent data around COVID-19 disproportionately affecting racial and ethnic minority communities, it's particularly relevant. And just wondering what FDA, NIA, private industry, what are you doing to continue to address this issue, which we've known about for quite some time and have not been able to sort out how to solve yet, although from Dr. Menard's comments, it sounds like we might be making some progress. So who wants to take that on?
I'd like to start and just acknowledge that we recognize that this is a big issue. And in fact, NIH has been working very hard, as you may have seen in some recent announcements, to accelerate the rate at which discovery is made for vaccines, therapeutics in the COVID-19 pandemic. And very high in the considerations is the fact that this virus is disproportionately impacting not only older adults, but traditionally underrepresented minority groups. Thus, we've been able to announce a series of funding opportunity announcements to really focus on reaching into minority communities, to get people ready to think about vaccination, to participate in studies, to participate in therapeutic trials. And I've been very edified to see the degree of motivation and energy that's being put towards that by everyone in the NIH leadership. The National Institute on Aging with the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities has in particular led these what we call RADx Up initiatives and continues to work very closely not only with them, but with the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute and multiple other institutes and centers across NIH to try to make sure that we make the appropriate outreach and have the appropriate people involved in the studies.
So I'll hit on this from three sides. From my perspective, first of all, it is something that at FDA we talk about as important, but we just can't give it lip service. So the first is to be vocal about its importance, but also, for example, we have listening sessions for our medical reviewers and our scientists at FDA so they can understand the practical impact of disease on real families of many different backgrounds. The second thing is that we need to also understand where we need to actually have special understanding from a clinical trials and research perspective for drugs on differing populations. And two examples there are that we've learned from real world data studies that certain prostate cancer drugs perform differently in people of African American background as compared to others. And that's actually leading to FDA asking for specific studies to be considered in order to make sure that we understand those drugs better in prostate cancer. And we're starting to see some similar questions coming up now in the COVID-19 space. The third thing comes from my work when I was at Duke and led some studies for NCI, where we studied what did it take to increase recruitment of the older person and also people from underrepresented backgrounds in clinical trials. And what we learned is that there are a number of clinical trial capabilities on the ground at sites that need to be enabled, but also practically speaking, that you can't just sort of say we're going to increase numbers. That actually requires not only education capabilities, but it also requires understanding that it may take more time and energy per one person enrolled, but that time and energy is really important. And so being able to figure out what does that mean is very important also. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll just make two quick points, I think quick. The first is that, like I said at the beginning of my talk, if the policymakers set requirements, the ingenuity of companies and academic centers to do what it takes to find the people that would be representative, I think is substantial. As long as the teeth are not in the policies, then it's just hard to make it a priority. And I think that's been the history that we've seen. So I hope that the policies at NIH will be implemented with vigor and attention to grantees. On the tax side, it's really fascinating and probably no surprise in a digital environment, if you make something available, the people who typically sign up in larger numbers are those who are more activated, more highly educated with higher incomes. But there are ways of reaching other people. And, one program I'd point to that is fascinating is the tobacco advertising that the FDA does, which is very well funded because it's paid for by user fees and uses the same ad agencies that the tobacco companies use. And it was amazing to me to see how specifically targeted you can get to reach a population. I grew up in South Carolina, so I love the teenagers who drive pickup trucks with shotguns in the back. They go to particular social media channels, and that's where they hang out. So you need to be there if you're going to reach them and encourage them. We are a bit involved in warp speed now because the primary place that people go for just searching the internet is the various channels that Google has. And, it's a very delicate issue of how you, when it's appropriate to reach people, to give them an opportunity as opposed to other things in advertising where channels may be used to extract money from people. And finding that right balance is a challenge, but we're working hard on that. If we don't do something active, it's very predictable that the vaccine studies, for example, will be short of minorities and older people. So we're really highly motivated to try to help with that.
And could I ask a follow-up question to that? Is what's your understanding about the insight we've had around for clinical trials, whether for therapeutics or for vaccines? What sort of success have we had trying to get older adults and underrepresented minorities, again, both who are disproportionately affected by COVID-19? How much success have we had in getting them into the trials?
If you look at the phase 1 vaccine trials, where the only publicly available data are, not much. We really are just getting activated now because I'll just speak for the Google side. There are policies that are meant to protect people from being approached for things they shouldn't be approached for. And so we have to work through each of those policies. And as you know, the recruitment for the phase 3 vaccine trials is just starting now. So I'm actually optimistic that we're going to be able to make a difference there and increase the representation. And I think there's a strong argument for over-representation because of the issue of who needs to get the vaccine first. So we're hard at work on that.
Indeed. So we've got about 5 minutes left for questions, because I want to save a couple minutes at the very end give you each a minute to share any sort of take-home messages that you hope the audience would benefit from your individual perspectives at NIH, at FDA, and in private industry. And then I'd also like you to think about, come up with what one word in your mind sort of captures your perspective on the likelihood that we're going to have success in improving the inclusion of older adults in clinical trials, say over the next 5 years. So I asked you to think about that while we take a few more questions. One that's come in has to do with clinicaltrials.gov. The questioner says, the general perception is that it's not updated on a regular enough basis with findings, et cetera, and wanted to know if anyone can comment on whether there are any plans to put any more resources into that, or to in any way shape that in a different direction.
I could begin to answer that, and because clinicaltrials.gov is managed through the National Library of Medicine, which is one of the institutes and centers at NIH, and they are in the process of reimagining clinicaltrials.gov, and they're very focused on making it as accessible and user-friendly as possible. And again, that 21st Century Cures Act that I keep mentioning, it gave lots of mandates in lots of areas, and one of them, it is the requirement for studies to provide final data within the year of completion for scientists to provide final data in clinicaltrials.gov. So going forward, I think it's going to prove to be even more useful resource because of that mandate, and because it's in the process of being reimagined and modernized.
Yeah, I don't know, Amy, if you're involved in the clinicaltrials.gov policies, but I appreciate Dr. Bernard's comments, and I'm smiling when she mentions 21st Century Cures, because I spent about half of my time as commissioner trying to get that bill as right as we could possibly get it. So I'm glad to see it's having impact on what people are doing. I would just make the point that 2 points. One is there was just a court decision requiring sponsors to go back and fix all the non-reporting from previous years. And secondly, and that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Secondly, I was involved closely with Kathy Hudson at NIH in finalizing the final rule on clinicaltrials.gov. And it's just important for people to realize that the law requires that all clinical trials be registered, whether they're lousy clinical trials or good clinical trials. And what we really need are intermediaries between the government Most people don't want the government deciding what a good or a bad trial is, but we need some intermediary between the government and clinicaltrials.gov to take advantage of the increasingly rich data that's in it and to translate it into something that's actionable. This would be a great role for, as it relates to aging, for public organizations that deal with aging to play a larger role in taking the data from clinicaltrials.gov and making it useful.
And Rob, I'm not involved in the current discussions right now around clinicaltrials.gov inside of FDA, but two comments as it relates to what you're saying. When we took all of the clinicaltrials.gov information and sorted it out, and this was before its most recent update, but sorted it out to understand what was the portfolio of clinical trials happening in cancer, what we identified was that there was a mismatch between the planned and ongoing clinical trials in cancer to essentially the people who really need us to be doing the clinical trials the most. So we weren't, shooting our arrows in the right place all the time. Sometimes that's got to do with, where the biology and the science is taking us, and sometimes that's got to do with where the incentives are. But the other thing is that ex-US, as you know, there is more focus on trying to right-size that. Where should the trials be based on what are the population requirements? And being able to use clinicaltrial.gov to at least inform us what the match or mismatch might be is the first part of the task. And then we can start to think through how do we do it better.
Part of the implied question, I think, was why don't we, remembering that the responsibility for completing the data is the sponsor. It's not the government's responsibility. In fact, the government can't fill in the data. It has to, and so why don't we enforce it? And I would have never thought about this, but the problem is if you start enforcing it, you need lawyers because every institution is going to defend itself. And where do you want the FDA to prioritize its lawyer talent in the midst of so many other really, really serious things going on right now? So
yes.
I hope, though, that like patient groups will out people that are not completing their data and help make it happen.
Thank you, Dr. Califf. With that, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to give us their 1-minute summary of things that, from their perspective as it relates to research and development, drug research and development for older adults across the lifespan, things that we want to make sure the audience is aware of or thinking about. And if you could also end with what one word captures how you feel about the likelihood that, say, over the next 5 years, we'll make meaningful progress in improving the inclusion of older adults in clinical trials. Dr. Bernard, can I start with you?
Yes, and I think that we are making substantial progress. When I was seeing patients on a daily basis as an academic geriatrician, I was always confronted with data that was derived from younger populations that I was trying to apply to my 80-some-year-old patients. And I think that the changes that are afoot are going to change that and make it feasible when I am 80 for my physician to appropriately apply data to me. And in terms of likelihood, I'm optimistic that 5 years from now, we will see that there has been a change in approach. No question, this will require that people not only adhere to the strict rule about not excluding older adults in studies. It requires that studies be reconfigured, approaches to recruitment and retention be reconfigured, as has been covered generously in this workshop. But I'm hopeful that we will see a change 5 years from now when we reevaluate how well older adults have been included in NIH-funded phase 3 clinical trials.
Thank you. I'll take hopeful as your word. Dr. Califf, could we ask you to provide any final comments?
Darn it, I'm going to sound cup half empty here, but I think we have to remind ourselves that we're in a country that's seeing a decline in life expectancy, largely driven by increased mortality in people with common chronic diseases, focused in older people and the people we've just been discussing who are disadvantaged in our society. And so the way I could switch to cup half full would be if we fix the policies so that the incentives flow differently. And then I have complete confidence in the ingenuity of American researchers and healthcare entities and others to fix this problem.
Thank you, Dr. Califf. And Dr. Abernethy, you get the last word, please.
Well, Rob, I think stole my word, but I'm gonna highlight it. So, you know, the key initial message being the importance of enabling policies, but I want to build on that and make sure that I highlight the importance of demonstrating what's possible and creating implementation and familiarity, because I think that's as important as saying what needs to be done. And then, you know, my word that goes along with hopeful is ingenuity. I actually think that what's going to take us there in the next 5 years is putting the right policy and structure in place and American ingenuity that's going to go along with it.
Wonderful. I like it. Ingenuity. It's a great way to wrap up this panel. So thank you, Dr. Abernethy.